Hey everyone, it's Mr. Southerd coming at you with a lesson about the Practice FRQ for Unit 5. We're going to talk about 2D arrays and specifically the free response question that's assigned from essentially code.org. Okay, so just remember it's for practice. Okay, but obviously the actual free response will probably look kind of similar. Okay, so there's a couple things that we want to go over from the get-go, which is basically you have, we're going to talk about grayscale image. And so what they're going to talk about is we need to know basically a black pixel has a value represented as 0, and a white pixel is 255. So again, that's kind of pretty importantly put right here in code as well. But we need to know that basically those two numbers exist. And there's some range in between that's going to represent different scales of gray or shades of gray. Okay, so first thing off the bat I know is we have a 2D array of pixels already created, and there's a bunch of code that's shown and not shown. And you can look at this on your own. And kind of what's crazy is there's a part B where we're going to take the row and column and we're going to add 2 to each of those and see where that fits in the range of values that are stored. So we'll get to that in a minute. So basically, as I go through this FRQ, I'm kind of looking at, okay, what are they kind of giving us in terms of background? We have basically the main thing I picked up on is right there, right? So we have black is represented as the color of 0, white on the grayscale rating is represented as 255. So there's some numbers between 0 and 255 we got to kind of be aware of. Okay, let's take a look at part A. So we have to write the method count black pixels. So I'm kind of keep that in mind because that's my target. And there it is again here. Okay. And I'm going to go ahead and return, right? So that's kind of important. Let me start using different colors because it's starting to get kind of monotonous. So returns the number of pixels in the image that contain the value black. So in my mind, I'm kind of thinking here, let's think of a way to have some sort of, counter. We need to basically include all of the numbers of the pixels. When I look at this example right here from the image, right, here's essentially it's a 2D array we're looking at called pixels, and I have all the sample values in here. And so I'm going to pull out my little highlighter, and I'm going to kind of highlight the areas where I see a 0, okay? So kind of as you do this with your eyes, think about what the code program is doing. It's going row by row, if you're going to do row major traversal, and it's finding where the 0 is going to be, right? And then when you find all of them and you count them all up, right, you'll find that there's probably 6 of them, and that's what it says right here, in 6. Okay, so basically keeping that in mind, I need to write this count black pixels method. And then furthermore, in part B, we have more to do with kind of a change in the values. So we'll deal with that in a minute, but let's take care of the easier one first. All right. So in terms of me looking at this, what I'm thinking is we need some sort of counter, right? So I have this public int count black pixels, and I need some way to store a counter. So what I'm going to do, and I'm going to go ahead and just use the text box since I'm on the PDF. I thought this would be easier than trying to mess around with a Word document, but I'm going to go ahead and type in the code. Okay, so first things first, I'm going to go ahead and say, well, we're going to do a for loop probably because anytime you want to traverse a 2D array or a 1D array for that matter, you're going to have to use a for loop. And what I did is, since we're counting, I'm going to go ahead and declare my counter. All right, let's go ahead and make that a thing. And then I'm going to go ahead and start my for loop. Okay, so for a regular old for loop, okay, I like to use, and if you're curious, this is coming from lesson 3, where we did row major traversal. Now, there is a way to actually use the enhanced for loop, but for me, because I like to have a little bit more control in terms of what I'm doing, and it's kind of easier for me to work through, I prefer to use the row major traversal. But if you're having a good time with enhanced for loops, I'm happy to take a look at that for you and just see how it works. But this is kind of the way I did it. First thing I'm going to do is, just like we did int index equals 0, et cetera, kind of the recipe to follow is we need to do int, and I did row index equals 0. And that's kind of similar to if you watch my videos for lesson 3, I did the same thing. So I'm going to set row index equal to 0, and I'm going to do row index less than the name of this 2D array is called pixels, and then we're going to do dot length. And specifically, we're going to go through the row first. So we're going to do row index plus plus. That's kind of that first one. And then I'm going to do another inner for loop, right? And this time I'm going to do the column index. And of course, you can write COL or whatever floats your boat. But here's the main thing is when you get to the part where you're going to run this thing to the end of the column, you need to put a bracket 0 here. Okay, and that's going to denote that we're resetting essentially and starting from column 0 and referring to that column dot length. And then we're going to do column index plus plus. Okay, so then now I need to know, well, we need to look at each one of these, right? And see like when is this thing actually going to be black? So in this case, I'm seeing that each of these is going to, whenever we have some value equal to 0, we need to go ahead and return that, right? Or show that we have a counter for it. So to get to that if part, I'm going to go ahead and write the if statement, right? And then here, because we're setting the column index and the row index, we can go ahead and use that to our advantage to say, hey, if in that array of pixels, right, we get to row index, bracket column index, whatever that is, depending on which part of the loop I'm at, right? If that's equivalent and use the double equal sign, and I did 0, then we're going to go ahead and add 1 to my counter, which I set as 0. So we're going to do counter plus plus. Keep in mind that you have to have int counter already declared and initialized to be set to 0 because we're going to add 1 to it every time we hit this loop. Okay, so then after that, close out the brace, right? And I'll try to center since I'm not in the compiler, just like you aren't. And then we're going to close out that for loop if it'll let me. And let's go ahead and return counter. Right, and that should be the end of it. Now, one thing I noticed, which was kind of interesting, and if you actually look at the key directly from code.org, I didn't do it this way, but I realized that they did have this guy right here, where they did static final, right? So they made a static variable called black, and that's already set to equal to 0. So if you wanted to down here, you could have very well, instead of saying, hey, if it's double equal to 0, you could have just put in here the word black, right? In all caps. And that would have worked fine too. But the way I see it is I'm going through row by row and finding these zeros, right? So I'm just counting all of them or adding 1 to the count every time I see one. So I figured that would be good. I'd have to look at the rubric again just to see, do they dock you points for using black or not? But that to me seems the most logical. I suppose if they're concerned that maybe there's a program written where it could be a value from 0 to 10 or some sort of range, maybe. I'm not sure why, but that's the way they did it, and I'm just kind of letting you know that. Okay, so that takes care of that. Let's take a look at part B. As I try to explain in class, part B is a little bit trickier because there's a couple things happening here, which is kind of hard to understand. And that's why they gave you this before and after lightning image. So basically what they're trying to say for their criteria, and I'll try and list it out as a little text box, just so it's a little bit clearer, is basically the condition is saying, well, we're going to basically take the original row, right? So let's say this is the original row, and then we have some sort of, original column. We're going to go ahead and take that, and we're going to add 2 to that value, and add 2 to the column value as well. Okay, so if I had row 0, column 0, my new rows and columns would be a +2. So we're going to take a look at whatever that value is, and we're going to see is the original row, right? Whatever that output is. So say it's 0, 0, right? If that plus the second value, the new value, so the +2 would be 2, 2. If that's greater than or equal to 255 or white, then we're going to go ahead and I'm trying to move this somewhere where you can kind of see it better. Right? Then we're going to go ahead and set it as 255. If those two same values are going to add up to be less than 255, I guess this would be less than or equal to 255 or less than 255, then go ahead and just do the addition. Okay. Trying to find a spot where this can go where you can kind of see it. I guess I can try and squeeze it right in here. Okay, so that's basically what they're trying to do. Now, if we get a situation where, let's say we started with row 4, column 4, right? Basically, you're going to start to add row 4, column 4 with 2 each. So it's going to be 6 and 6, right? There's no row 6, column 6. That does not exist. So then if that's the case, we're just going to keep it equal to whatever 4, 4 was. Okay, so keep it unchanged. So that's what they're trying to say here, if that makes any sense. Okay, so then I'm going to come down here and I'm going to kind of think about what are the changes that are happening. So just to kind of show this part out, if you take, for example, row 0, column 0, okay, we're going to add that to the new guy, which is, I'll use a different color. Let's use orange. Row 2, or so row 2, column 2, which is this guy. Okay. Right. So again, the rule that they're looking at is we're going to start with row 0, column 0, and then we're going to add 2 to both row and column, and then find out what that value is. Then we're going to add those 2 up, which is 52, and see if that's greater than 255, which obviously it's not. So then if that's the case, I'm going to go ahead and just add the 2, and 52 plus 0 gives me just 52, right, which is this guy. So it remains basically unchanged. Let's look at the next one. Now go to the trying to switch back colors. So you see how here for row 0, column 1, we have 203. And the corresponding plus 2 to both those values would be row 2, column 3, which is 201, right? Oops, I used a different color. All right, so if we add those two together, 404 is definitely much bigger than 255. So then what happens is that original value of 203 becomes 255 right there. So we're going to do that for each one of these. Okay, so you can probably kind of see that the word if pops up a couple times. So that means we're going to use a conditional, at least one here, to make this work. Okay, so kind of keeping all that in mind, let's actually get to some of the coding, right? So I've kind of gone through all this. Let's do a text block here and go ahead and get started. Okay, so we have public void light and image. And what we're going to do is the first thing I'm going to do is I need to go ahead and traverse through the rows and columns. And the way I did it is I first kind of built the inner outer for loop so I can traverse through it. And essentially, I'm going to go through, and there are multiple ways to do this. Even on code.org, they give you in the answer key when I looked it up, there's multiple ways to do this. So as long as your way checks out, it's fine. It just makes it harder for the reader to go through and just imagine some of the possibilities. But that's what you get with some of these FRQs. Okay, so basically, the way we're going to start is I'm going to go ahead and do a for loop to get things going. There's no counters or anything. I just need to see which one of these conditions is met. Okay, again, this is kind of the way I did it, so you don't have to certainly do this way. So I did, once again, int row index equals 0. So I just did a regular for loop. I did row index less than, again, it's the same 2D array called pixels, right? So all of this is going to seem kind of monotonous and similar. And then I did another inner for loop, which is the int column index. So again, I'm kind of going row major, right? And don't forget that 0 bracket for the dot length for the column. And I'm going to do column index plus plus. Okay, so now I've built the 2 for loops. So as I go through each of these, I need to know a couple things. I need to do an if. So I'm just kind of doing like a little pseudocode, if you will, or just comments saying like if, right, the sum is greater than 255, right? We need to set 255. And then if sum is less than 255, right, then I'm going to do just the sum. Okay, so that's kind of some of the things I'm thinking about here. If it's greater than or equal to, I should say. One more thing I forgot to add, which to me is the first thing you should focus on, is what if row plus 2, column plus 2, right? Row plus 2 and column plus 2 leads to somewhere out of bounds. Then we're just going to keep it as the original row and column. Right, so that's kind of all the things I'm thinking here. So I'm going to kind of space that down. Okay, so I need to first, so you might be thinking, well, Southern, how do you know which one to start with? Well, the first thing I need to kind of combat is the row plus 2, column plus 2 going to go out of bounds? In which case, like, that's kind of a big one, right? Because if we're out of bounds, then I don't need to do any sort of calculation other than just keeping it the original. Okay, And then once I've kind of clarified that that's not the case, then I can go ahead and actually do the math that I need to. So what I did is if that row index, right, because that's a value, so we're going to start with 0 plus 2, right, is going to be less than, well, there's a couple ways to do this, but if you want to do row index plus 2, so I'm thinking when row index is like 3, right, 3 plus 2 is going to be out of bounds, right? So if that's less than the pixels dot length, I suppose you could use the numbers, but I tend to shy away from just using numbers. Because one thing I've noticed with the AP exam, what they like to do is they'll give you these things and say, here, here's an example of what it could look like. You don't know for sure what the array is going to look like. Is it a 5 by 5 like we see here? What if it's a 7 by 7, right? So don't necessarily code to what's given to you. I'd rather be safe and use the length of the array rather than anything else. So if row index plus 2 is greater than pixels dot length, right? Oh, sorry, if it's less than, my bad. Well, I'm just going to say if it's greater than, right? So if row index plus 2 is greater than the length of the pixel, or if column index, right, plus 2 is greater than pixels, and I need to use the column value, right, the bracket 0 dot length, then I'm going to go ahead and worry about what's happening, which is we're going to go ahead and set it equal to pixels, right, with row index, column index. Right, so if any one of these is true, then let's go ahead and just cap it as that, right? One other way you could do it too, now that I think of it, is you can also, instead of worrying about what's out of bounds, maybe we go ahead and code for what's in bounds and then otherwise just show nothing else. Okay. Um, so let me think of it this way. So let me rewrite this. That's one way I started it. Here's another way it kind of comes to mind. What if instead of doing greater than, okay, and all of this, because I can go ahead and keep coding it, it'll work fine. What if I decided to switch it a little bit? What if I said, well, if these two are both in bounds, let's switch that to an and, then what would it look like? So if row index plus 2 is less than, right? And I could do, since I'm doing pixels dot length, I don't need to do a -1 because it's a less than. I'm not including the pixels dot length, right? Because we always do pixels dot length -1, but in this case we don't have to because it's going to be just purely less than. Right? So what if both of those are true? Well, now I don't have to necessarily code for, hey, this possibility that we go out of bounds. Now we're just saying, look, I'm only going to consider options, right? Because we're going to do this change if and only if we're going to keep it within the bounds of the 2D array. So if that's the case, then go ahead and use that pixels, right? And let's do row index, column index, right? Because if we're in bounds, then I want you to go ahead and code for the value to be added on together, right? So it's going to be pixels, row index, column index, and then you can go ahead and add that, right? And we could do the plus equals, right? Because this is going to be something that keeps adding as we go along with the pixels, row plus 2, column plus 2. Sorry, row index, value plus 2, excuse me, and then column index plus 2. Okay, so again, we're in bounds. We're going to go ahead and add the two together. Now, there's a problem here, though, right? Because we need to code for the fact that, well, what if this value that we have is now bigger than 255? Okay, so again, there's a multitude of ways to do this, so it's not like this is the only way to do it. But what if I say, okay, so let's say this results, like we're going to go do this if. So for inbounds, go ahead and do the sum. Let's say the sum is like we saw earlier, 403. Okay, so this second line or this 1, 2, 3, fourth line of code here I'm on, that's going to result in 403. At first glance, you're like, uh-oh, what's going to happen, right? That's way too big. Well, we can do one more if statement that's going to run next, which is to say, hey, if that pixels row index, column index we just found, right? Now the value is going to be 403, right? Keeping with the same example I mentioned. If that's actually greater than 255, right? At this point, so if I'm at 256, or in this case 403, then I can go ahead and code for the next line, which is go ahead and set that row index, right, equal to 255. So right, so we're beyond, so we're in bounds with the 2D array, but the sum of the two are greater than 255. So I'm just going to cap it at 255. And the beauty of, so there's going to be some version you're going to do of this, right? So again, there's going to be a variety of answers, so it's totally okay. Um, but basically what I'm trying to do is if we're already out of bounds, so if this first if returns a false, then we're not going to do any of this. And the original row 0, column 0, which was 52 up here, that's just going to stay the same, right? It doesn't change. But if we get something in bounds, right, and the value is going to be, sorry, not 52. Like if I chose like this guy right here, we did row 0, column 4, right? So the new one I'm going to add it with is row 2, column 6, which does not exist. So right then and there, we're going to come into an issue where it's like, okay, we're going to go out of bounds right here. So if that's out of bounds, I'm going to ignore the rest of it. If we're in bounds, then go ahead and add them up, and then I'm checking to see if they're over 255. You can also check to see if they're over 255 and then add them up or do whatever from there. But this if will only execute if this condition above is true, right? That's kind of it there. And again, what kind of troubles me is when I looked at the code.org key, it also references white. So I don't know if because they used it as a static, I'll have to double check, but because they used it as static, they assigned that variable white to be equal to 255. If they want you to use white, if that's part of the rubric, I'll double check. So just so you know, instead of 255, maybe they use the word white, and that's okay. I'm trying to think what else. I guess I'll close this out, and that's kind of it. How many curly braces do we have? That's 1, 2, 3, 4, and then there's a fifth one for the actual method. Okay, that should give me 5. I'll leave these comments here though, because that's just more for me. And they're not going to grade the comments. So that's that. Again, there's multiple ways to do this. I'm kind of curious to see what you guys come up with. I've already seen some of you guys come up with some cool answers, but pretty much we're all in line with what we're trying to do. So I hope this helps, and I'll answer more questions from you guys.